You are listening. Women Up Radio.
Good afternoon and welcome to Women Up. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Valerie Fridland, Professor of Sociolinguistics at the University of Nevada, language expert for Psychology Today, and most exciting, the author of the new book, Like Literally Jude, which is all about speech habits that we love to hate. I cannot wait to read that. So welcome to the show, Valerie. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, I'm so excited to be here. I can't wait to talk about language a little more.
That's right. Yeah, because we're going to talk very much about how sociolinguistics can change how we react and interact, and also how we're perceived in career and life. And at one stage during the talk, I'm going to ask you particularly for women, because obviously women being one of the key things and how we can be viewed, etc., etc. I think that's really important. But can I start? Sociolinguistics, it really does fascinate me. I'm working in teaching and helping foreigners understand English and business and things like that. But the whole idea of sociolinguistics, it's much broader and it can have such a huge impact on us and everything around us. So can you give me a few examples of really how it can impact our daily life?
Sure. Actually, first, let me sort of step back and explain to people what sociolinguistics is, what we look at, because sometimes I think people have a image of what that might be that might not be quite what we study. So a lot of times when people notice differences among speakers, we think about words or expressions. So what are new words that people are saying? A lot of times we'll talk about things like chuggy or drip are two words that, young people are using in the United States these days. Or we think about the way someone comes across in terms of, I don't like the way they sound, but we don't think about what it is exactly that we really don't like or that we like or what we're reacting to. Yeah. So sociolinguistics looks less at what we say and more at how we say things. So we're interested, of course, in new words and terms and expressions that come into the language, but more fascinating are the small patterned usages that we have in our daily speech that we don't even realize say something about us. They tell people where we're from. They tell people what our gender is. They'll tell people what our ethnicity or our age, and they'll tell people our attitudes and our beliefs and our stances. And we don't even realize that the little tiny sounds we might make actually communicate that kind of information. We think about words having meaning, but actually smaller parts of language have meaning. So sociolinguists study those things as well. And a great example that probably most people haven't thought about that say a lot about you and affect the way you're perceived are something like how sounds are pronounced like T. T in English actually has a lot of different ways it's articulated, and we don't even realize it that they come out differently. We think of them as T's, but a lot of times we don't say them the same way. And it's very patterned. It's not arbitrary. We say them a certain way for certain social and stylistic effect. So let me give you a couple examples. We have something called a released T and an unreleased T in English. So a released T would simply just be something like, what? Did you hear that little puff of air at the end?
Yeah.
So that's sort of the release or the aspiration, meaning the airflow continues after you make the articulation of a T sound.
Yeah.
An unreleased T would be what?
Yeah.
Where it's sort of subtle. There is a little bit of a, stoppage of the air, but you don't hear the big release. Alternatively, we might glottalize that T where we say something like, what?
Yeah.
You don't actually make the T, you don't make the articulation of the T sound. Instead, you make a stoppage of the air at the glottal area in the glottis. So those are three different T's. We actually have many more T's than that, but those are three great examples. So think about what it communicates stylistically when you say what?
Yeah.
Or what? Or what? Just that little change in one sound has said so much from a social perspective. So when might you say what? When you're angry, when your kid's driving you crazy because they keep saying, mom, 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 right? Those are the times you might say that. When do you say what? What? When you're at work, when you're just talking to people you may not know well, right? When it's kind of formal and maybe there's a lot of social distance between you, so you're not going to be angry at them for one, and also you're not going to say what, which you might say to a friend when they are saying something like you did something, you'd be like, what? I didn't do that. So there's a lot communicated stylistically from just the choice of T. Now, what's really fascinating is we all alternate those Ts, right? Yeah. We all have those variants that come up in different times, but they're pretty patterned. So I could probably predict by the context you're in and who you're talking to, which one you'll use at that context. But I could also tell based on your gender, your age, your ethnicity, where you're from. All those things also impact the rate at which you use those three different variants. So glottalization, the what form, is actually something we see that's rising in younger speakers. So it started in about the 19th century. That's the first time we have evidence of any alternation between a glottal and a non-glottalized T. But it seems to be an increasing variant in English, not just American English, but British English, Australian English, a number of world Englishes, Irish English, Scottish English. And what we find is young people drive change, and it's younger speakers that tend to use more glottals than not young people. I'll be pleasant there. Not the old people, but the not young age.
Yes.
And women are also sort of at the forefront of using glottalized variants, which might surprise people because a lot of the image we have of glottal variants is Cockney speech, and that does tend to be more men that use glottals in Cockney speech. Yeah. But worldwide, when we look at more subtle usage, so not the sort of highly stereotyped Cockney use, but more subtle uses, like what? It is women leading that charge. So we see this really interesting overlay between what we're trying to do and accomplish in that moment. So whether I'm exasperated, I might use a released T. If we're really casual and intimate friends, I'll use a glottalized T. So there's something about the context, but there's also something about who I am from a social perspective of where I'm from, you know, what gender I am, those kinds of things that affect the overall rate of my use of those three variants. So here's something we probably never thought about. I mean, how many people listening have ever thought, oh, I'm using a glottal T? Never. Yeah. But yet it is saying so much about you when you use them.
Yeah. And okay, so I'm thinking internationally. For example, I'm not sure whether this is really sociolinguistics or this is just almost dialect. We have different cultures. We've got different ways of interpreting comments. And even, you know, the different countries, like you said, the UK, Ireland, Australia, US, Canada, we say things which sometimes they're totally misinterpreted by other English speakers. So things like pissed. In English, if I say I'm pissed, it means I'm drunk. Whereas in the States, it means you're angry, right?
Right.
So I'm not sure what it does in Australia and places like that. But is that any relation to sociolinguistics? And can you see a big difference with the different countries?
Absolutely. That's one of the areas that we tend to look at, people like me. There certainly are the examples such as piss that
That's the only one I could think of. It's not the most delicate, but
that the meaning is different. Well, there are a number, especially in British English versus American English. One of the things that's happened sometimes is certain words have been retained in American English that were lost gradually in British English. So I think fall versus autumn is a good example of that, right? In the UK, you say autumn.
Yeah.
And in the US, we tend to say fall. And that's because fall is actually an older word. And it fell out of use in Britain. It became less popular. Another example is gotten. I have gotten it versus I have got it. Again, gotten is an older form that was retained in American English that was lost in British English or English in the UK, where you'd say I have got. So there are subtle differences like that we tend to think of as just sort of differences, or we often think the other person's wrong.
Obviously, yes.
There's usually a historical reason for the variations that we find. But I think more broadly, the types of things you're talking about are a lot of times cultural differences in what things mean. So a good example, I think, is the glottal T I was talking about. In the UK, it's really strongly marked for class. Yeah. So using a glottal is something that we find in Cockney or other sort of non-standard dialects or non-prestigious dialects, but we don't tend to find it in estuary English. That's actually one thing you don't tend to find a lot of glottalization in sort of RP or estuary English, which are the more prestigious forms of English in Britain, the more standard considered forms. But in the United States, it's actually not strongly marked. So if someone says, what? people don't really comment on it. So those are things that you don't have any awareness of generally, but when you go to another country, people might respond to it in a way differently than you're expecting because their understanding of that feature is different. But a great example of cross-cultural problems with Zoom is this idea of how much silence is acceptable across cultures.
Yeah.
That is something we learn as children. There have actually been a number of studies that suggest our routines for how much silence is preferred between talking turns is very culturally bound, and different cultures have different levels, and Americans are very intolerant of silence. So when you look at sort of studies that measure how much silence is comfortable for speakers, Americans are some of the least comfortable with silence. British English speakers tend to be more comfortable with silence.
Yeah.
So I can't remember. It's like, 2 milliseconds different, but it's still different. But if you take sort of Finns or Japanese people, they're very tolerant of silence. So if I'm on a Zoom in an international business meeting with people from different cultures, our level of comfort with how much silence is allowed between turns might do something as significant as affect how much I talk.
Yes.
Because if I'm not comfortable with silence and there's a lot of silence, as an American, I'll tend to jump in because it's uncomfortable for me. So I'll fill that silence. But if I'm a Finn and I'm very comfortable with silence, I'm going to take that person as being kind of obnoxiously over talking.
Yep.
Because they talk too much. They're actually responding because it's uncomfortable for their cultural norms, and it's considered rude to lead a lot of silence. But if you're a Finn, it's actually rude to talk too much. So here we have this case of norms in what's appropriate for speaking turns and silence that affect how we are going to perceive each other as pushy, as silent. So I might think a Finn is rude.
Yes.
Or uninterested in what I'm saying because they're not responding quickly enough. So these are really fascinating cross-cultural differences linguistically that affect how successful we are in business contexts and personal contexts.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because, I work with a lot of different countries and I have to explain to some of them because as well as being a coach and international career development and things like that, I also do business English part of the training for non-native business people, non-native English speaking business people. And I have to tell them very much, slow down because they're all speaking too fast and leave a gap. So say something, say a sentence, stop, leave a bit of silence and then say something else because it shows authority. Whereas if you're always yak, 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 to us as British, it means either you don't know your topic or you're lying or you're trying to be a pushy salesperson or you're very insecure and you're trying to jump to the next topic. So I'm always go down at the end of the sentence to show authority, stop and leave a gap so people can see you've got the confidence and that really what you're saying is worth listening to. Is that related to sociolinguistics? Yes, a little bit.
Absolutely. And those will be culturally determined as well. I think Americans tend to leave less gaps. In fact, there have been some studies on subcultures in American English that really like a lot of high involvement overlap. So what you're talking about is something called the turn-taking model. And so it's part of discourse analysis and sociolinguistics, which are two sort of closely related fields. And that is, how do we structure talk to be most successful in our communication, or how it really studies just how people tend to try to structure talk. So how much cues do we give? How many cues do we give when we're coming to the end of a turn to signal someone else it's their turn to talk? What kinds of cues do we give when it's not someone's turn to talk so that I'm going to continue on? And pitch is very much involved with that. So what you were talking about of lowering your pitch at the end of a turn often signals to someone else, I'm done. Just the same way that a rising pitch can signal to someone else, please come in.
Yes.
This is something I'm inviting you in. So there are different ways to do this. But Deborah Tannen did some work on New York Jewish communities where she compared New York Jewish communities and non-Jewish communities for how much overlap in talk they have. And what she decided is there are certain cultures that are high involvement cultures, which means to show interest and signal sort of savviness in that culture, you actually overlap and talk a lot. you talk a lot, you overlap, you kind of cut each other off because you're signaling, I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
And it's not considered rude. But when high involvement speakers get involved with low involvement speakers, which is sort of what you're talking about, where you leave space between turns, you sort of lower your pitch, you don't jump in the next turn really quickly.
Yeah.
That causes problems because high involvement speakers don't understand what low involvement speakers need in a conversation and vice versa. And so that comes across even in the same culture as being rude or being disinterested and uninvolved. So I think really it would depend on what culture you're talking to. A lot of times we find that Spanish speaking cultures are very high involvement cultures as well. And so then leaving more space is maybe not the appropriate choice. But I think British English and a lot of European countries other than in Spain, maybe that is more appropriate. So Scandinavian countries, for example, come to mind. So it really is very culturally determined. And yes, that would be part of really discourse analysis, which is sometimes involved in sociolinguistics.
It's really interesting. So, and coming on to women, obviously, and particularly women in business, because my field or my audience is much more business. Professional women, and I know because I've worked in various countries where there's been very different attitudes, but language can have very different interpretations. And so, like I said, a man can be considered confident or authoritative, but women using exactly the same words, they're considered pushy or aggressive. And I've seen this and I've experienced this, and it's so unfair. It drives me crazy.
Oh, it's very unfair.
Do you think that's true, or is it an exaggeration and I was being neurotic or paranoid or overreactive or something like that?
That sounds like what someone's told somebody about the fact that they're noticing an actual pattern, right? And this is the problem, is that we often as women get told that we're being overreactive or paranoid, when in fact research strongly supports the fact that what you said, that women are often construed as annoying or irritating or pushy when men would be just authoritative, happens. It does happen. And I've written actually quite a bit on this topic because it's something that's very dear to my heart, because I think it is something that women tend to internalize as a problem with their delivery, and they try to correct it when really what we need to correct is the social attitude and the cultural model that says that women are pushy when they talk. But if we look back in history, what we find is that women's talk as being annoying, being vacuous, being problematic goes back as far in time as ancient antiquity. So we even find philosophers like Aristotle commenting on the value of a silent woman and chastising women that are not. We see a lot of that even back in that day. Then we fast forward to the Middle Ages, which is really not the time we think of as being, women's liberation. And in fact, women's tongues were often criminalized. So it was called sins of the tongue. It was when women, or actually anybody, it could be accused of sin of the tongue, when women were publicly overly talkative, especially about things that were critical of the crown or critical of men or critical of something in their community, they could actually be charged with something called a sin of the tongue, and they would be put in something called a scold's bridle, which is like a Hannibal Lecter mask that would actually go in their mouth and hold their tongue.
Oh, really?
So it was like a metal. If you want to, people can Google what is a scold's bridle, and you can actually see pictures of it. It's basically like a Hannibal Lecter mask, except it holds the tongue. It goes in the mouth and holds the tongue, depresses the tongue so you can't talk. And in studies that looked at who was charged with sins of the tongue in the medieval period, it was almost always women. So we have not only sort of devalued the talk of women, we have criminalized it over history. So then after the Middle Ages, we went less about criminalization and more about socialization, so that women in the 18th and 19th century were told that to be elegant, to be high class, to be appropriate, they were supposed to hold their tongues and be lovely and have a perfect pitch that was not too shrill, and talk little, and only talk when spoken to, unless they were in the company of other women. So can you see this progression that we've had of women's talk never being valued, but going from being, the silent woman to being the criminal woman for speaking out, to being the polite and dutiful woman who only talks when talked to. And so we have instilled this idea that women's talk is somehow less than that of men. And this carries over today where we don't criminalize it. We don't stick things on women's tongues, but we silence them in other ways. And one of the ways we do this is by holding them up to a cultural model that says a silent woman, a non-loquacious woman is a valuable woman. And so this also alerts us to when women talk, we hear them more and we judge them more. So if you look at studies about who talks more in a variety of contexts, like educational contexts or professional contexts, the belief is it's women. So if you ask anybody who talks more, a lot of times people say, women talk all the time. And that may be true in social context, although we don't have that much evidence that, in fact, that is the case, even in social context. But if you look at professional or educational context, almost every study shows that it's men that talk more. We just notice women doing it because we have been so ingrained in us this belief that women's talk is trivial and unimportant, that when women talk in important contexts like education or business meetings, we notice it more and it irritates us. And so women, indeed, for talking the same amount of men, are held accountable in a way that men aren't. So unfortunately, the research does support exactly what you say, that women are viewed as being pushy and aggressive for the exact same behavior that men would be considered competent and authoritative over.
I find it very frustrating that. But so there must be, if we become more skilled with or more knowledgeable with sociolinguistics, as women I'm talking now, there must be ways that we can use linguistics, particularly in business, to enhance our progress, or there's some things that we can do or say, things that are going to have a better reaction.
Well, there are a lot of different things that we can do. And absolutely, I think it's surprising to me how little we know about linguistics as speakers of a language. I mean, we all speak all the time and we get so much done by it. But the only way we know about language, the only way we learn about language is very prescriptivist in school. And we learn it all in the same way, like what's a noun and a verb, and do you end your sentences with prepositions, which are great, right, for writing, but they don't really help us in communication. And we don't learn a lot about that. So one thing is to make sure that those that are high up and have some power in meetings to distribute turns of talk are aware of the linguistic research, and that there's a factual basis for this idea that women's talk is devalued. And it's not just women's talk. It tends to also be minority speakers. People that haven't historically had power tend to be judged more negatively when they talk more, even if it's unconscious and an unconscious bias. Same thing with people that have a heavy accent. We find that when we look at literature about how people are judged that speak with accents, if they say the exact same content as an accentless speaker in whatever language they're talking about, they are less likely to get investment capital, they're less likely to be hired, and they're less likely to be judged as competent. So they're saying exactly the same thing. And the fact that they're saying it with an accent seems to automatically devalue their talk, even though it's exactly the same. So I think really what's important is to make sure that the stakeholders are aware of this imbalance and they do things to make sure there's a more equitable opportunity to talk in contexts where it's important, like meetings, for example, or like exchanges with clients. One of the things we can do is we can make sure that we're not just leaving an open floor for everybody to jump in, because studies show that when you do that, those with power, whether it's social or cultural power or power in the organization, talk more. So when you talk more, you represent your view more. And we even find with the Supreme Court, when we looked at an analysis of Supreme Court justices, what we find is that male Supreme Court justices actually get more turns at talk because women tend to get interrupted more. And female Supreme Court justices got interrupted at a much higher rate than male Supreme Court justices, both by men and women. This is not a men problem. This is an everybody problem, which simply means that who gets more say in the direction an argument goes or the direction a client meeting goes, those who talk more. So you need to sort of be aware as a stakeholder, as a manager, as someone who runs a meeting, that this is something that's happening. And can we come up with ways to make floor turns more equitable? Absolutely. Have it be everybody that gives a certain 5-minute spiel during a meeting. You can, or you select who you think are the power players in that meeting and you have them talk,
Yes.
or you actually distribute the turns so that people don't just jump on into the floor, but you say, okay, Mary, can you tell me what you think about this? So those are good ways that we can make sure there's more equitable turns at talk. But as an individual, it's a little trickier. One thing you can do is make sure that if you don't feel you will be judged appropriately for talking in a meeting, because sometimes, you would love to talk, but you know that you're going to be viewed as pushy or aggressive. There are different ways you can communicate what you think you want to get across. You could write a report, a memo, and distribute that. You could email stakeholders prior and say, hey, just in case this doesn't come out in the meeting, here's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Because the problem is for women, if they don't speak up, then a lot of times they miss opportunities for promotion.
Yes.
Because people don't think they have anything to say. Rather than realizing that they're not able to say it, people think they have nothing to say. So even if it's not in a meeting, the more you can get your voice heard in some context, whether it's through email or through an aside with the boss later on, or by requesting a certain type of organizational structure in meetings that allows everybody a turn, you can actually take a little more control over that.
Yeah, that's great ideas. I would never have thought of that. I mean, for me, when I've been in meetings and I can't say what I want, I just force my way in, which then underlines the fact that I'm pushy and aggressive, and it doesn't help for other women at all. But all of that and the idea of emailing beforehand and things like that, and having structured meetings with like the 5-minute spot and asking the person to speak, I think that's brilliant. If more companies did that, it would just make everything so much more balanced.
Absolutely. And so what we have to do is not just work as individuals, which there are steps you can take by doing things like I suggested, but to also make sure that stakeholders and power players and power brokers in organizations receive training on this. There are lots of different ways that you can make sure there's a more equitable distribution of power, even outside of meetings, just in the way that we are aware, because what we find is a lot of times if you make people aware of bias, it reduces bias.
Yes.
So we're not doing this because we're mean people. We're doing this because these are the cultural models that we've had in front of us since we've been children.
Yep.
But by making you aware of these cultural models, there's really good research that suggests it reduces bias. And that can be with accents, that can be with gender, that can be with all sorts of things that come into play. Even younger speakers often have bias against them. And again, being more aware of the linguistic aspects behind the way we talk can really reduce bias in those ways.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Valerie. That's been really valuable. Can I ask any final piece of wisdom or key strategy that you think we should keep in mind going forward to help us, particularly as women?
Well, I think not to be so hard on yourself, because my biggest worry with women is that we have internalized these ideas.
Yeah.
And so we judge ourselves for them. And women, everybody does it, but women in particular beat themselves up for the things that they think they did wrong. And so be gentle with yourself. You're not doing wrong things.
Yeah.
You are just in a social historical context where you have to work a little harder to get what you want to say out there and received positively. But don't be hard on yourself. So give yourself a little slack and realize that these are long processes of change that we have to enact, and it will take a while, but don't beat yourself up for it.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Lastly, where can people find you and get in touch with you? And can you give us just a quick idea about your new book?
Absolutely. Well, one thing is my book is available now for pre-order. It's not coming out for a few months, but you can go ahead and get in line anywhere books are sold. So Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, anything like that. And my book is called Like Literally Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English. And it's all about these speech habits that we worry so much about. So umming and ahhing, saying things like literally, non-literally, singular they. So pronoun use is a big thing people worry about. And even things you hadn't thought about. So for example, whether you say walk-in or walking. So how you pronounce those G's. all of these have fascinating histories that some of them go back 1,000 years, but almost all of them go back several hundred years, which we don't expect. And they have really exciting new uses and purposes. And we are not at all aware of any of these. And it's so fun to learn about how we started saying like all the time and where literally came from and who used it in 1600 that we should use as our models and things like that. So I would love it if people would find me there because it was really a fun book to write. And I think it's an enjoyable read.
That sounds brilliant.
Yeah, it is. It's a blast. It was so much fun. And really anything you wondered about language is in that book.
It would be very good for me then.
Yes, I think you'll enjoy it. And then people can also just subscribe to my email list at valeriefridland.com. So if you go on my website, you can subscribe and you'll get all sorts of news from me every month.
Lovely. And will you send me all the links to these so I can add them to the webpage?
Absolutely. I'd love to do that.
Brilliant. Okay. Valerie, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been fascinating. Really,
it's been so much fun.
Thank
you for having me.
Everybody, this has been Valerie Fridland. Don't miss her new book. Don't miss signing up because there's just so much you can learn and it's so interesting to get the history of it. And I hope that I will see you all again next week. And very luckily, we're going to have Valerie back in a few more weeks to talk in much more detail about her new book. So don't miss that. I'll put it up on the upcoming guest list and you'll be able to see when she's coming back to join us again. Have a great week, everybody, and see you again soon. Bye.